All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to World Regional Geography. I have a feeling that throughout this class that I'm going to learn a lot from you and you are going to learn a lot from me, hopefully. So when we think of geography, we can think of places like states, countries. We think about, are there mountains or plains or oceans? And world regional geography is much more than this. Um, this is an integration of many factors to help us to understand human society and the relation to its physical environment. Now, the easiest way for us to represent information is from a spatial perspective. And here you see we have maps, and we can look at the fact that we have a map of North America and Canada, and it is representing North America, what we want to look at. If you look at the scale below it, 1 to 103 million, the larger the number, the um, the further out the scale is. If you look down to the left at the city of Montreal, you see that the scale is 1 to a million. You see that the area is much larger. So we can use scale to represent an area that we want to fix on. Now, we can make maps show us anything that we want. If I'm driving to a new area, on my Google map, I will have the terrain, the roads. I will have on, are there accidents? Are there gas stations? Are there speed traps? So I really can take a map and I can tailor it to the information that I am interested in at that time. Well, in this course, we're going to look at geographic realms, and the realms can be defined by culture, by economic factors, by a shared history, by politics, whether the same or different, and also by environmental features like rivers and mountains. But not all of these realms are neatly defined by a boundary. There's going to be some overlap. So if you look at the map of Montreal, you can see that the yellow is basically the city center. And as you go further out, you're moving into the suburbs. Where there is overlap in these, we call these transition zones. Now, the realms defined in this book are based on many similarities, and we're going to look at these in detail throughout the course. So we need to know first that there are two types of realms. The first is monocentric, and monocentric means that it is dominated by, excuse me, a single major political entity, like in terms of territory and population. So if you look at the United States, we're under a single political entity for the entire territory and the population. Mono meaning one thing, monocentric. They're also polycentric. And polycentric is where you have a number of factors in common, like culture or economy. And think of Europe, where they have across many nations, the European Union economy and sharing. And that is a polycentric realm. So if we want to, we can actually subdivide. There it goes. Sorry about that. We can actually subdivide realms into regions. And what I have brought up here is two perspectives of the Pacific Northwest. The one on the left is organized by states, and the one on the right is organized by vegetation, mountain areas, and other physical similar properties. So the way I define a region doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the same way that you would define a region, but we do understand it. And when we look at realms, we can know that they're related to each other. So if I tell you that the Midwest is a realm and the Pacific Northwest is a region and a region, then you have an idea in your mind after looking at the map how they are related to each other in space and time. Now, so let's talk about functional region. And a functional region is a type of region that is selected because it functions in the same way. And again, we have this map of Montreal, and the yellow, the downtown, the core area. As you move outwards, you get into a farther region that is no longer the core area. We call it the hinterland, but this city functions as one. So it is a true representation of what a functional region is. All right, now we're going to lay some groundwork. We need to look at population. And to understand population, it's not just the number of people that live in a country. It also has attributes about their health, where they live, do they have good drinking water, and countries can be ranked based on their gross domestic product, but that's not necessarily a good representation of how all of the people in that country are living. Gross domestic product just talks about money. But the United Nations created what's called the Human Development Index. And this takes into account things like access to education, access to healthcare. Do they have a clean drinking water source? And factors like that that affect the population in their day-to-day living and not just based on the number. So in this, the way I would describe this is going to be through more developed countries and less developed countries. Now let's look at some attributes here. I have Belgium on the right, which is a more developed country, and I have Malawi on the left, which is a less developed country. More developed countries are exhibited by, they usually have good health care. So they have a longer life expectancy. Their death rate is down. There's education. So as you see in Belgium, the mother's mean age at first birth is 28 years old. So she's gone on to something before deciding to start a family. They have access to clean drinking water. Infectious diseases are really not even a factor on their, excuse me, that's represented in the numbers of illnesses and deaths. Now, if we look at a less developed country, we're going to look at Maui. We can see that the infant mortality rate is 15 times higher than it is in Belgium. The median age in Malawi is, excuse me, 16 years old. Whereas the median age in Belgium is, excuse me, I can't see what it is because there's a thing right there, 41 years old. Now, in less developed countries, you generally do not have a very stable government. You're usually in an area where your population is spread out. A lot of countries that are less developed countries, the people rely on subsistence agriculture. So they can grow enough food to be able to feed their family, and maybe have a little bit left over at the end to, sell to a market. Also, they don't have infrastructure such as roads or water pipelines, but they also don't have access to like sewage or trash. And so it just stays in the environment where they are. Infectious diseases in sub-Saharan Africa are so prevalent that 1.5 million children die each year from waterborne diseases that we don't even have to deal with. The population tends to be young. The women are having an average of 5.5 children per woman in Malawi. Because there's such a high infant mortality rate, that means that there will be a more higher probability that one of their children may die. The more children they have will be able to work the land. And in some of these cases, the greater number of children that you have, the higher standing you have in your status because it's seen as being blessed. So if you look at both of these types of countries, more developed and less developed, we're going to go into these numbers in each of the realms that we're looking at this year so that we can see it's not just is the economy good, it's are the people being taken care of. All right, so there is a lecture. I have this as a written down lecture under the lectures folder this week. So you will be able to go through and read more of these things in detail. All right. Now, let's move on to population. And we're going to find that people live sometimes because that's where the society before them lived. They built a city there. And so it was just easy to go ahead and build a city there. Um, is it on a river? Do you need a source of water or a navigable river to transport your commerce? Are there fertile valleys? I mean, are there places where you can actually grow crops and feed your people? So we're going to see that a lot of the reasons why people live where they live is mostly based on these geographical factors, as well as climate. Like in the tundra in the north in Siberia, not a lot of people live there because, excuse me, it's not fertile and it's not probably a place that you could make a subsistence living out of. All right. Now we're going to move on to historical geography. And this is where we look at who's been there before, how did they use the land, um, did they have a different political system? And first, we need to realize that every country in the world has been influenced from the outside, even the United States, to Papua New Guinea, whether it was through colonization, people came in after just indigenous people were living there, whether it's a foreign government stepping in, or trade that's bringing in new products, new religions, new ideas. All areas of the world, except for the very, very remote, have been affected by this. And in some ways, it's changed part of their culture. Now, let's look at Europe. On your map, you have the Roman Empire. But before the Roman Empire, the first group that were affecting culture were the Greeks. And the Greeks had laid a foundation of science and philosophy, art, political science, elected governments. These are actually what we base our democratic societies upon, but they did not, they were not able to go and take over a large territory. Now, from 27 BC to 476 AD, the Roman Empire spread from Great Britain to Spain and Mesopotamia and North Africa. Some of the reasons that they were able to do this were, one, that they had armies, they had an organized military. They developed routes both overland and oversea with infrastructures, roads, cities, aqueducts. They were able to take this area and provide not just methods for people to go from one place to another, but for them to also have potable drinking water. All of these were linked to one capital, that single seat of power in Rome. And because of this, this was a stable political system over time. And when you have a stable political system over time, you can do more than just try and feed your family. These are the areas where the government is taking care of, things like relations with other countries and protecting you. And so you have more time to come up with new ideas on how to do things and be innovative or create new products. So during this, they did what's called local functional specialization. And that's where they decided that one good was going to be produced in a single place. So let's say that I'm the part of the Roman Empire where I make shoes. And that's pretty much all I do in that area. They've decided that's it. Well, you're not competing with 10 other places in the empire that are making shoes. And you also might be right next door to some place that makes socks, and you have these complementary communities coming in. Now, when the empire died, these places were left with these specialty areas, and some were good. Like if you're farming and it's good farmland, then that legacy is one that you want. But if manufacturing something that's not important anymore, if that was the mainstay of your city's economy, that's a negative. During the Roman Empire, Christianity was spread. The Romance languages like French, English, Spanish, and Portuguese aspects of culture, building materials, all of these things affected uh, who's going to come and live afterwards, because there is a legacy of the people who lived there before. Now, after the Roman Empire died out, um, we'll move on to the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire was at its greatest, it basically had a monopoly on all of the trade from Europe all the way to Asia. Some of the things that they did, though, were they brought in hospitals and healthcare. I didn't know this, but they made forceps and scalpels. Um, they brought new mining technologies into these areas, which when the empire fell, you had access to these new technologies. Um, they built cities and roads and the infrastructure. So there's so many, we're going to look at so many awful cases of colonization. Um, right now, I just want to stress that there are some benefits, but this is probably the last time that we're really going to talk about any benefit of major course in the class. So, all right. Now, in the 15th century, there were these rising monarchies that were going on in Europe, and the countries started a new age of they were they were discovering new continents. They were bringing gold and silver and all different materials and foods back that they had never seen before. And in most of Europe, you had monarchies being set up: the King of France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Germany, and colonization was happening in force in all the other parts of the world, but all the goods and the profits from it were coming back to benefit the Europeans. Now, what happened in the 17th and 18th century was the Industrial Revolution happened. And this is what really revolutionized European dominance of countries around the world. The steam engine had been built, but it was discovered that rather than wood, coal would be a really good source of fuel for it. And so you were no longer relying on cutting down ever dwindling forests. You could dig up coal. They also found that coal was really good because it could be used very efficiently in making steel. So think about railroads and things and having access to this manufacturing that made this hard steel ships. I mean, it really kind of it really expanded the ability of places that they could go and that they could go efficiently and safely. And the shipping of this time began the new age. So industrialization started in Britain, but it spread across Europe in the next 40 years. And then we move into when Europe starts to, excuse me, battle against each other. And the map you see right here is Europe pre-World War I. And you can see that Austria, Hungary, and Germany have much larger territories than we've seen. Now, let's look at post-World War II countries. So on the left is what the countries were after World War II. You can see Germany is really big. You can see Czechoslovakia is big. Yugoslavia is big. And what we see is that after wars or territories, that there are certain governing bodies who decide the outline of a country. And they may draw it like in Yugoslavia as one country with one people, but historically those people have not worked together, have not liked each other, have not wanted to be part of the same state. And if you look at Europe today and you see where Yugoslavia was, now you see all of these countries on the Balkan Peninsula that broke apart. So we're going to see a lot of places that the colonizers are the one who drew the boundaries of the countries, and that those boundaries were not culturally, politically, economically healthy. And so stuff has to be undone. Now, after World War II, the countries decided they had to come together because they didn't want another uh, country in their region to be able to go and take over other countries. They also needed to rebuild because so much of the structure was destroyed. And in 1967, they um, developed the European Community, which eventually became the European Union or the EU. Now, on your left is the European Union on the screen. So there are conditions that have to be met before a country can join the European Union. First, they have to have a stable democracy. They have to have good human rights issues and protections for minority. They also have to have a functioning market economy, the capacity to cope with competition between the same markets within the European Union. And they have to be able to take on the obligations that come with membership, and they have to stay within the political, economic, and monetary factors that are part of the European Union's government. So, because maybe you can see that Switzerland, Iceland, and Norway decided they didn't want to be part of the European Union. And as of last year, the United Kingdom seceded from the Union. They also adopted a currency, one currency, the euro. But Sweden, the UK, and Denmark decided that they wanted to keep control over their own currency, so they didn't adopt the EU. Now, another group after World War II that came up is NATO, and that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And there are multiple tenets for this, but when you join, like when 9/11 happened to us, an attack upon one is considered an attack upon all. So because the United States was attacked, the other countries of NATO had to come to the rescue. If something happens to, let's say, Italy, we're all legally responsible for going to help Italy. And that's to help stop rogue nations from doing bad things. But it's an important kind of membership in a different way that we can see countries who may be disparate in a lot of things, but want this to be part of their charter. All right. Now, this is what I am basing the class on. I went through and I looked for ways that we could describe an area that each week we can look at them for Russia, we can look at them for Europe, we can look at them from sub-Saharan Africa, and it will give us an idea of how they relate to each other or don't relate to each other. So the first that we're going to look at each week is physical geography, which is the base, the location. It's also the physical boundaries around a country, whether it's on an ocean on one side or another country on the other side. Does this area have access to seas, oceans, or lakes? But part of economy is being able to move your goods or to go get your natural resources. So having navigable rivers to move up and down is very important. Mountains can be either a barrier for trade, like in the Andes, where in South America, where it's just going across it for any kind of normal trade route. It's very difficult. Do you have good ports where trade will bring in all kinds of goods and the economy will grow? And I think one of the most important things to look at is a country landlocked? Because if like, we'll look at the Czech Republic, it's surrounded by multiple countries. If it has manufactured goods or natural resources or something like that that they want to be able to take to other parts of the world, they have to go through another country. And this could mean tariffs and all kinds of stuff that would hinder natural commerce. And we're going to see, like in South America, where Paraguay is devastated only because it has the same amount of natural resources, it has the same amount of a lot of stuff, but it has to go over the Andes or through other countries to get to the seaports to be able to get their goods out or to bring their goods in. The second thing we're going to look at is population. Where do people live? Why do they live there? We talked about more developed countries and less developed countries. And then there's a group in between that are called emerging countries. They're not less developed anymore, but they're not quite more developed now. And we're going to look at several of those over the class. The Human Developmental Index that we looked at, the sheets of that show, infant mortality rates, sickness rates, and everything. And then we're going to measure resiliency. So if a hurricane hits North Carolina and afterwards, FEMA comes in, the state steps in, volunteer groups come in to help and revive and revitalize that area. That means shows that it's resilient. If you have a hurricane and it hits the coast of Honduras, which last year 2 major hurricanes hit Honduras 1 week apart, it devastated the country. There wasn't the governmental aspect that could come in, to take care of, the health and building and stuff. So we're going to look at, are there ways that some populations can become even more resilient than they are right now? And I think that's a very good thing to look forward to. Another is historical geography. It's basically who lived there before and who colonized, because like I said at the beginning, every place has been colonized by some other place. Now, political geography is just where we look at the political system. We have a democracy, and we talked about the fact that if it's stable over a long time, that there's more time to develop an actual culture in the society in which you live. We talked about being members of international organizations like NATO. One of the big things we're going to look at is who drew the country's boundaries. And this is specifically awful in sub-Saharan Africa, because the rulers actually came together with a map of sub-Saharan Africa, and they just carved up what they want. And then they went and they took it, not paying any attention to what the people groups were there, the systems of agriculture that could be different, the religions that could be different, the fact that people may hate each other, and it made a horrible situation even worse, and the legacy that many of these countries are still dealing with today. So also in that political, there's what's called a failed state. And a failed state is where the government can no longer provide for its people. It can't protect them. It can't feed them. It can't take care of them in any way. And some countries that are failed states right now, we're going to look at 2 of them over the class to see why they failed. And we're also going to look at how they can be helped to come back into a stable place. All right, economic geography. Let's talk money. So in economic geography, we look at commerce and trading partners that you have. And the European Union is one where you have a trading block. We're going to look at in the realms, do they have good amounts of mineral wealth, including oil and gas and coal? Austria has so many natural mineral resources right now, but it's not a fully developed MDC because it had to deal with the legacies from 2 world wars and then reparations, and does it have the money to put into getting those out of the ground? So Do they have forests? In many areas, like in the UK, people have lived there for so long that they've cut down a good portion of the forest because they needed firewood for their source for energy. Um, Arable land. Do you have land that's fertile that you can grow crops on that are going to have high yields that are going to be able to feed people, not just in your country, but maybe around the world? Monocropping, like some of the islands in the Caribbean that were under French or English rule, um, what they developed in those countries was, okay, let's say this area, all you're going to do is produce sugarcane. And then they left the government. Now they're their own independent country, but they only have one resource, one crop, monocrop. And if something happens to destroy that year's crop, then they're left with nothing. So we're going to look at that as part of the historical and current economic geography. Um, have the countries been through the Industrial Revolution? Now, the United States, what some of the things that we got from being colonized by the British were, we got the technology for railroads. They laid infrastructure, roads and everything. They set up cities. So we started off as a young country when we became independent on a higher level playing field than a lot of other countries are. So today in Guyana, which is in South America, it's a poor country, and it has gold and some oil and gas. And the population is 50% ex-African slaves, and then 50% ex-indentured servants from India. And you can see the cultures playing there, but it's not a prosperous country. Well, in the last 15 years, they've discovered world-class deposits of oil and gas offshore of Guyana. And if they produce this, they will be able to take their country, if the government is not corrupt, to a new standard of living. And we're going to look at some of the choices that we make. Well, if they pull those hydrocarbons out of the ground and burn them, then they're going to increase CO2 emissions, and that's going to affect the atmosphere, and that's going to speed up climate change. But then, do we really have the right to say, we got to ruin the environment and we're really far ahead of you, but you can't do it because it might hurt the earth? These are places and issues where there is no single answer. There are things that have to be looked at in the larger complexity of the regions and the realms. All right, and finally, cultural geography. This is where you share languages, religions, ethnicities, customs and traditions, ways of doing things. They may be as simple as farming that's way more effective than what you were doing. So, oh, and finally, climate and climate change. What is the climate where they live, and what effects of climate change are they feeling right now? The Sub-Saharan Africa only puts out 3% of the entire world's global greenhouse gas emissions every year, but they are suffering from the worst effects of drought. It's very disproportionate, the suffering that they're having when they weren't the ones to put them out in the first place. But regardless of what the source is or where it is, every country has to address climate change for its people and for its future. All right, so let's look a little bit at Europe. If you look here, you see that, excuse me, Europe is composed of a lot of peninsulas and islands. It has 40 countries, and there are about 600 million people that live there. If you look at the physical landscapes, you'll see that we have the Western uplands, the Central uplands, the Alpine mountains, and the North European lowlands. Now, the major mountain ranges, the Alps and the Pyrenees in Spain and the Apennines down excuse me, um, Italy, the Carpathian Mountains in Romania. Um, all of these at one point or another have been used for a defensible position or a barrier to travel. Because Europe is so far along, a lot of these have been, I don't want to say conquered, but there's now a tunnel that you can go through basically through part of the Swiss Alps, rather than having to try go up around, make all of these different roads and stuff. Um, Europe is also blessed with navigable rivers, like the Rhine River that starts in Germany. It heads out to the port of Rotterdam, and major manufacturing is along the Rhine. They situate it there because they have the water, and there are also other resources, and it can take it not over a long distance to be shipped out to somewhere else. So that's very economic situation for them to have. Um, Europe's climate. So the Gulf Stream, the warm water that comes up around Florida and crosses the ocean, um, touches the west coast of Europe. And you can see the humid temperate climate that's there. That's because you have the warm water there, and then the air is blowing over it, and warm, moist water is coming over. And even though this is the UK is at a latitude much higher than like Maine, it still has that same climate, which enables them to grow crops and and have industries and be able to uh, ex, ex, accelerate at uh, agriculture. So they can have major bread baskets there that can feed, they can be food self-sufficient, which we're going to look at is could be an issue in some places. They don't produce enough food for the people. Now, let's look at the projected effects of climate change on Europe. And you can see these are based on color. So the light blue is covered the Arctic, and that's basically Iceland. And what they're seeing there is that the temperature is increasing faster than it is in other places in the world, which is going to help melt ice, permafrost. And when you change a habitat, say something was dependent on Arctic sea ice like polar bears, and then we're getting to the place where the Arctic may be ice free year round, that species is in danger of becoming extinct. In the blue region, the boreal region, here you're going to see a lot more heavy rain, less ice and snow, and the winter storms are going to become more damaging. In the mountainous areas, they're actually finding more extreme heat and droughts, and the glaciers that are in those countries, in the spring when they melt, the meltwater comes down and it comes into these valleys where people are planting crops, and they expect that meltwater to come and water their spring crops to grow. Well, if you keep melting glaciers and ice, eventually you're not going to get that spring melt water that's going to come down, and your land is going to turn more arid, and you might not be able to produce high yields of food there anymore. If you look at the purple, which is the Atlantic, the big one is higher risk of damaging storms, because we've seen a lot of flooding in the last couple of years over there. The Mediterranean region, which is also like a food basket, and a lot of people go a vacation there, they're expecting extreme heat, and that extreme heat means you would need more water for agriculture. If you change that habitat and it becomes more arid, then the animals that live there are going to move because they're not adapted to it. You can also have a loss of tourism. In the continental region, in the green, more extreme weather, fires and flooding. And finally, the coastal regions and the seas. And the sea temperature, the surface of the sea, the temperatures are rising, and the oceans are becoming more acidic. And so where you may have had a population of fish that was acclimated to that zone. If the conditions become unlivable, they're actually going to have to move to somewhere else. And in places like the Philippines, where 70% of the people rely on fish for their daily protein, this could have devastating effects. So there's some of the projected effects of climate change. Now, so here's some of the cultural aspects that came out of the different waves of people who lived in Europe, who influenced Europe, who dominated them. You can see the number of different languages that are found there. If you look at the ethnicities of people who have been moved around, um, you have so much homogeneity now. And finally, the Balkan Peninsula. This is what they being colonial people, describe this area as Yugoslavia. And these groups of people have hated each other for centuries and centuries. And so when they put them into one group, whether they were labeled as one country or not, the fighting is so much and so often that they call this area a shatter belt. And it's not one that they think until something drastically changes, it's just going to continue shattering and being a place of war, and not having enough food, not being able to take care of people, your government. So we're going to look at several more of these. And one thing I have to show you on this slide is if you look at Croatia, it's yellow, and it comes all the way down the Adriatic Sea. Do you see that it gives absolutely no, you have to go through Croatia to get to the sea. Like Bosnia Herzegovina could have its own little sea access, but no, Croatia decided that it wanted the whole coast. So pretty strategic, but also probably not very nice.